the kind of last chapter of the book is about Europeans, the kind of European reception of New York, and what he characterizes as this like mixture of jealousy and admiration that major cultural figures in Europe feel about New York as this self-evidently incredibly modern city that's also kind of outside of the sort of conventional center of the civilized world. And it's, you know, it's sort of interesting that definitely at the time, I think Americans...
And that I am buying. The feeling of like inferiority, moral superiority, but actual inferiority, jealousy, all of that, that's all real.
Oh yeah, that's absolutely on the surface. Like when he was sort of when he sort of relates like Le Corbusier's response to New York, like obviously that's what's going on emotionally. That I think is indisputable. But one of the things that's interesting is that I think that like Americans at the time, and this is probably something that would only change after the Second World War, like feel this kind of slight sense of like deference towards the cultural superiority of Europe. And like the architects of the Rockefeller Center, for example, go on a big study trip together to Europe and look at lots of modern, like important European buildings to make sure that they're kind of across all of the stuff that's going on in the world.
It's funny, isn't it? Because they don't
seem to have incorporated any of it.
I can't grade the Rockefeller built Center. I haven't been there.
Yeah.
I really don't know. There's some things about this. I find it pretty inscrutable.
Yeah.
Like, I'd have to go. And even then, I might not get it right the first time. But what it definitely isn't is like an overtly brilliant work of like sculptural modernism.
No, absolutely.
Informed in any way by the genuinely interesting things that it's not like, although European avant-garde were jealous, it's not like there's nothing interesting that they were doing.
No.
Like, Le Corbusier was a genius, and he was one of quite a few working in Europe at that time.
Yeah.
There's a reason that these people were still talked about and that they're very important.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know what they were doing on their study trip. I mean, having a lovely jolly, I hope.
I hope so, yeah. Ray and the boys.
Yeah, that's what I do.
So the Europeans chapter is around these two figures, which are Le Corbusier and Salvador Dali.
Guess which one of them Koolhaas likes?
Yeah,
he despises.
Yeah, well,
he's doing the same. It's worth saying Salvador Dali's reputation in high culture in the late 70s was as like, I don't know when he died, but he was as like a commercial sellout, huckster.
Yeah.
Which is
so
not
this is
completely
This is another reclamation job. Yeah, I mean, a lot of his work is rather horrible, isn't it? But there you go.
And he was a sellout, and he was a bit of a shit as well.
I mean, the Le Corbusier kind of thing is all kind of on the surface. It's quite obvious. Like, he comes to New York, he publishes all of this work about all of the things which are wrong with New York, and why the future is all about tall buildings, but not like the way New York do them. All of that is wrong. He talks about it like as a jungle.
He's saying what we need to do is combine those two things together. From a combination of the jungle and the skyscraper will come the perfect city on a hill.
Yeah, a lovely...
Which is a jungle with skyscrapers in it.
Yeah.
But his skyscrapers have all got to be the same.
And they're all massive and they're all spread out. And, he does these like sketches of Manhattan with kind of Radiant City-style skyscrapers incorporated on them. And he does these kind of comparative sections of, all of the cluster of all the towers too close together and then them like nicely and decorously spaced out.
Obviously, like, Le Corbusier's plan of demolishing cities and replacing them with skyscrapers. I mean, we tried really hard, I think, to make this anything other than insane and horrible. Yeah. And it is insane and horrible.
It's a big idea. I'm reluctant to condemn it. But yeah, you can see, I mean...
Really? Not its spirit. I'm not talking about condemning its spirit. I'm not talking about condemning it as a metaphor.
Yeah.
I'm condemning it as a serious proposal.
Oh,
for which I think it is grotesque.
I wouldn't be in favour of doing it literally.
Yeah, would it be a terrible, terrible idea? Obviously.
Well, it really depends a lot on the city, but in most cases, yes.
In, for example, New York or Paris, which would be the two examples that we could conceivably be discussing now. It would be a terrible idea.
That would have been a bit of a shame, yeah. Le Corbusier is kind of the guilty man in the death of Manhattanism. Ultimately, like, the end of Manhattanism is these sorts of Le Corbusier ideas, right? there.
Yeah, in the REM story, what seems to me to have happened actually, in my theory of urbanism, is that the core of the cities got very dense, and they got very dense up until the First World War, and then they were still sort of coasting on momentum until the Great Depression.
Yeah.
And then in the Great Depression, rather, the energy is taken out.
Yeah.
And that doesn't come back in until after the Second World War. But after the Second World War, the energy is moving into suburbia, building these ridiculous, like, white flights, building huge motorways through the centre of town.
Yeah.
And it's not an urban vision.
Yeah.
And the same thing is happening all over the place.
Yeah.
People have got cars. It's anti-congestion. The reason that Rem Koolhaas is talking about congestion so much is because of all these people talking about how they're trying to get rid of it.
Yeah.
In this book, Rem Koolhaas is also suggesting that all of that's because of modernism, which is definitely not true. I think all of that's to do with like cars and economic conditions. It's not because Le Corbusier didn't make middle class Americans want to move to suburbia. But anyway, that's sort of the postulated thing, is that actually what happens is the energy goes from vital native American New York spirit to the European corruption. Do you remember, was it in when we were talking about SMLXL, Rem Koolhaas has an anecdote where they're like, for Euro Disney, these Europeans are undermining the idea of Disney. It's like the competition to build. There's the competition to do the hotel in Euro Disney. Yeah, and all these like star architect, European star architects come along. And Rem Koolhaas is coolly hanging around at the back of the room with this proposal. And then like the people go out, and then like the guy from Disney is like, these Europeans are undermining the idea of Disney.
Okay. Yeah.
And in a way, which is obviously something that Rem Koolhaas has to say, because that's sort of how he imagines the whole world as being. Yeah. With Disney being everything good. And in a way, that's sort of what he's described here, is like these Europeans have undermined the idea of America, or like
the idea of Manhattan, certainly.
You know, there's been fluoridation, the purity of.
The seed has been.
Something is now lacking because of the cultural transplant.
I mean, I think his reading of like Corbusier's encounter with Manhattan is.
It's fine. Yeah,
kind of fine. I don't think it makes sense to me. What it's pointing towards, though, is this kind of post-war disenchantment with the city, and the turn towards cars, towards highways, towards suburbia. And
I mean, he even says like the problem is that like, one of the problems that's experienced is the failing facades of these towers built, which presumably had these like lovely facade structures that he's talked about a lot. These, and that just makes you think, okay, this is like. When you think of New York in the mid-70s, you don't hear good things about what's going on. You hear of decay.
Yeah, no.
And that speaks to me of a time of like people not like I reckon the very same buildings you go to them now. Yeah. The facades are not failing because they've been maintained.
Yes, no, I think that it was considered to be extremely dangerous at the time, and indeed probably was. I mean, I think we're going to just have to read this bit not in order, but the story kind of concludes with the 1939 World's Fair, which is this moment looking towards the future, which is a future of cars, is a future of getting out into the countryside. And although he tries to sort of single out bits within it which hark back to the various kind of dream images of Manhattanism, so these sort of like slightly updated versions of the like Venice idea. There's a kind of diorama which I think is all about electricity, where they were all sort of staring across the river against this like enormous diorama of the.
With these things, you often get like corporate pavilions and national pavilions, and that's obviously the corporate pavilion, the good sort for him. I would say, and it's just I don't know if it's Bell or not Bell. Whatever the
GE.
electrical GE. Look at what electricity does in the day and the night in Manhattan. And it's a big diorama with like lots of little light bulbs in it.
Lots of buildings,
Lots of little light bulbs and things, and they switch on and off.
But I mean, there's actually lots of other stuff in that. There are bits in that show which he doesn't talk about, which I think are more prescient, like this one, Futurama, which is literally the one of cities with enormous highways in them.
Yeah, and also towers that look really quite convincing. The thing that's interesting about it is we would now think of that as somewhere that's fairly horrible, but quite accurate.
No, this is kind of eerie. So
Like, that probably exists in China.
Yeah.
Except that it's not big enough. There's not enough of it.
Yeah. Well, yeah, or I mean, like shades of, Houston or all sorts of places. Yeah, the buildings are very like, noughties East Asia, aren't they? He doesn't quite say it as such, but like that seems to be what's going to assassinate
Yeah, he never quite
Manhattanism.
wants to make the connect with a lot of his ideas. It's like we had to describe his skyscraper for him.
Yeah.
And we don't have him here to go, is that right or wrong? I want a yes/no answer.
Yeah.
It's the same with this. He's not really willing to say that, like, modernism sapped. And he doesn't talk about this, does he?
No, this one's not in it. But
yeah, he doesn't talk about these things. He doesn't talk about the car. He doesn't want to mention the car. He doesn't mention... The name Robert Moses is not in this book.
I think it might be in the Coney Island chapter, maybe.
Maybe, but it's not in this book in the way that you would think it is.
Yeah.
It's not like the counter-revolution wasn't occurring
in
1978 in New York. It really was.
Yeah, no, he talks about this one, Democracy, which is a kind of looking down on the city from above.
A weak pun.
Yeah, he does. Futurama is the one which I think is actually, what cities are going to be like in the post-war, and he doesn't really dwell on that one, although it seems to me to be much more of the reason that kind of Manhattan modern model of urbanism was going to come to an end. There are these two figures, and like Le Corbusier is one of them, and the other one is Dali, who really he reads. This is where you kind of encounter. He uses the image of the Rosetta Stone at some point in the book, and like Dali is kind of the Rosetta Stone for Delirious New York. It's the moment where he kind of tips his hat to what the whole methodology of the book is. He talks about Dali's idea of the paranoid critical method, which is sort of creative use of psychotic reasoning, or kind of creative use of like slightly schizoid sort of reasoning, where you allow yourself to perceive a myriad of kind of patterns and connections which don't really meaningfully exist, but which are possible to kind of create and believe in through the power of sort of observation. And this, pattern matching is a kind of innate sort of human capacity, and you first allow yourself to think all these mad things, and then you kind of critically sort of pursue some of them to ultimately sort of create this fantasy, but which seems to have some sort of foundations in the world of evidence.
He describes this method, and and Rem Koolhaas also has lectures online.
Yeah,
that you can see where he's describing this method and this breakthrough.
Yeah,
two things. He describes Salvador Dali's description, where he's sort of describing like you kind of shatter an image, like turn it upside down and look at it.
Yeah,
and he also describes, which I think is a kind of metaphor for the approach of this to New York, how Salvador Dali arrives at New York, proposing it as a modernist city, and then discovers that it's really an ancient city.
Yeah.
He's like woken by the sounds of the animals in the zoo. He goes into a lift and it's sort of mock medieval, lit with a candle.
Yeah.
There's a building being blackened with soot to try and make it look old at a time when Europe is striving to be modern. Then I'm like, what really is this doing for Rem other than a justification? Do you think Rem Koolhaas has actually learnt a new method of reasoning from this, or do you think he's just justifying what he's doing already?
Yeah, I tend to think the latter. I don't think he really does it this way.
No, he doesn't.
No.
His way of doing it is extremely pasticheable because it's actually kind of quite possible to do, which is where the difficulty is that you have to like know all this interesting stuff and then be able to put these things together. But to be able to write this like exciting story using cliche and convention and kind of like, and then like lots of knowledge.
It's much more of a justification for the way in which he's like slightly torturing the evidence, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's much more what it's about. In terms of the actual conclusions that he's reached, those to me seem much more about reading several things in parallel, and I don't know, it's a bit more like Exquisite Corpse than it is like swapping things between them, essentially. Like the head of one goes onto the body of another.
He's got a thing he likes, and he can kind of imagine, and he's trying to like, okay, drop acid, go around New York, and imagine it as it should be,
Yeah.
And that's kind of cool.
Yeah.
Because the story he tells is sort of about a sort of place. The way that it shifts in tone between kind of social history and this exotic thing, I would be... It's so difficult, because if I knew... I would be asking a whole load of different questions if I knew New York at all.
Yeah.
But from the outside, it seems like this is a story that came with Rem to New York.
Yeah.
And then was kind of like grown from that seed up into the big thing. And he's using New York as a justification for all the things he loves.
Yeah.
And as a hammer to attack all the stuffy old things he's bored of.
Yeah.
And he desperately wants to be... He's like really conspicuously trying not to be all these other people.
Yeah.
Because he's not only... He's trying not to be Le Corbusier.
Yeah.
But he's also trying not to be Jane Jacobs.
Yeah.
And he doesn't want to talk about that.
No.
And he's trying not to be...
Rossi or any of those guys.
Definitely trying not to be Rossi.
He wants to do kind of a version of historicism which isn't the, sentimental kind of historicism.
Despite the fact that, like, the closest thing this is to is, like, Architecture in the City by Rossi.
Yeah.
It's just that that's for a different place by a different person. But, like, fantastical reasoning.
Yeah.
And actually, I've been to a couple of Italian cities since then, and I have thought about it because it kind of works.
Yeah.
And I actually suspect that if you went to New York, you would be able to get echoes of this place.
Yeah.
Because although it isn't, I imagine, how the city actually is, it is like a sort of potential. What for you is this method? Or does it have any relevance at all? Like,
well, it's a way of doing post-rationalization, isn't it? It's a way of, like, you sort of suspend criticality and then you bring it back in again. And sometimes you just have an idea which doesn't really make sense, but which is kind of attractive.
Yeah.
And then you figure out a way for it to be okay. Any of the ideas that, like, Manhattan is really a, like, radical project which should have a manifesto. Like, obviously that's the idea that you have at the beginning. And then you kind of sort of find a way to build the stuff that you know into a case. And it's a way of post-rationalizing this kind of post-rationalizing methodology.
I wondered if now, for us, because, like, this was like such a seminal text, and in a seminal text in the way of, like, it's something from the past when you're studying architecture that you haven't bothered to read, but everyone says is important, which then must mean it's serious. The band The Beatles is spelt differently because they're a beat combo and it's a pun. But you don't read that because it sounds so stupid because they've got, like, a joke pun name and they're such a big cultural phenomenon in history. That, like, the fact that this book is kind of quite like a joke. I'm not saying it's not like a significant, like, an exciting work. Now it's approached as like a major work of theory. Yeah. Like a serious bit of avant-garde must-read for a young aspiring architect.
Yeah, which is...
And that's it's a difficult way to approach it. You kind of got to chuck that away.
Yeah.
It's not that.
No.
It's a provocation. It's silly.
It's very silly.
It's silly and clever and fun. And
it's powered by this, like, immensely enjoyable
if it's important, it's bad. But if it's not important, it's quite fun.
It is really funny. There's a bit where he talks about Le Corbusier. He talks about Le Corbusier having all the accumulated bitterness of an unwed mother. And it's his kind of relationship to this like Manhattan architecture that he sort of simultaneously is enormously inspired by and also wants to repudiate. It's like everything is kind of powered by this sort of wittiness and this. I
think the degree to which Rem Koolhaas is a serious figure is the degree to which he's, like, odious and cynical. Because there are bits of it that are, like, cynical and horrible to me, but it's only when you take it seriously. If it's a joke. If it's kind of catty, and then it's great. Yeah. But...
I don't think you should take it too seriously.
If it's a firm foundation for something, or, like, a real proposal, there's some major problems with it.
No, I tend to read it in the kind of tone of his lectures, which are, like, full of...
Yeah, they're jokes.
Like, they're very jokey. And
it's satirical. And erudite. And knowledgeable.
Yeah.
And he does get into the, like, deep stories that people don't know about. We haven't finished this book. We're talking about as if we finished it.
Oh God, do we have to do the? Well, there's a final bit on the UN building, but I can't even remember what he says about it.
So the UN building is Corbusier's struggle to impose first his vision of architecture. So it's a whole load of blocks, and his idea is that we're going to have.
I mean, this is another design by committee, isn't it? Like when they were going to do, first of all, they had to decide where to put the UN, and then they got all these architects together, and preeminent among them was Le Corbusier. That like Oscar Niemeyer was also there. I think there were loads and loads of these famous figures, and I can't think of any other ones off the top of my head, but. And then it ends up being executed by Wallace Harrison, who's generally considered to be not an architect of the first water.
So, as it appears in this book, there's various machinations around site and things like that. But it is posited that, like, really, Le Corbusier's, it's between Le Corbusier and the kind of representatives of America and all the representatives of Manhattan. Le Corbusier wants this big space. And they're like a cluster of buildings, which is more or less what there is now, and then a big space, and then another tower, which is another big slab oblong.
Yeah.
To create a kind of showpiece for the tower and the jungle is the postulation. That is ultimately defeated and left with like the cluster of buildings that we know now, which has got this sort of sculptural low building and then a big office block.
Yeah.
At various points in the book, the kind of enemy of everything is grass. You exterminate life, culture, and interest, and you replace it with totalitarian grass. At the beginning in Coney Island, there was the idea that they wanted to exterminate these parks and replace them with grass. And here, it's Le Corbusier wants to exterminate the city and replace it with grass.
Yeah.
And it's the kind of fight back against that. Is one thing that's going on. And then he goes on to discuss a little bit the Lincoln Center.
Yeah.
Which actually he's very critical of. He maybe you were saying earlier that he was being positive about the architect of it.
Yeah.
But my reading is that it is a limp in this book, a limp like deflation. The energy, the core of Manhattanism has gone because it doesn't have this kind of commercial content. It is a series of cultural institutions, and as such, kind of existing in a sterile environment, and as such, is kind of dead. What it needs is commercial vitalism. In order to be a Manhattan thing, it needs the dynamic of like all these independent people engaging in commerce.
Yeah, well, the thing is that in this new world of the post-war, it can just be a cultural centre.
Yeah.
It doesn't need to have all the other stuff going on
So
at the
in
same
a way,
time.
it's kind of like the Opera House proposal, but without all the stuff that he posits as being great, which is the rentable space.
All of the intensity, all the congestion is gone. And that's the end. Or is it?
But it's not actually, because because as we said, it's not a book about just New York. It's a book with these paintings around it, and it's about Rem Koolhaas.
Yeah. So there's an appendix.
Oh no, we forgot the image on the. There is a whole. There's a bit more. We're at Postmortem.
Oh yeah, Postmortem. But the last two buildings that are just described in the book. There's the XYZ buildings, which are adjacent to Rockefeller Center. They're a kind of expansion of it.
And they're the buildings on the front cover of this version.
Yeah, weirdly.
And he says, that they are anti-skyscrapers, basically.
Yeah.
That, like, these are everything that is in his manifesto has been rejected.
Yeah.
They are just extrusions of the ground plane up. The most basic, the most atavistic form of big building. And that's more or less what he says about them.
Yeah.
The last surviving of his kind of heroic team is Wallace Harrison, and he has like a series of unbuilt proposals by him, which are kind of megastructural and strange, but still it's interesting to see because they're things that are clearly in a way from the like after modernism period, but they're still rendered by Ferris, and that's kind of cool. It's like a different sort of Gotham. But
it is at an end, except for the appendix. What should we do here? Should we? Maybe I'll just read a little bit from it. He says, after the chronicle in Postmortem, that's the last chapter of Delirious New York, of the shrivelling of Manhattanism, as if it had been too suddenly exposed to daylight. The appendix should be regarded as a fictional conclusion, an interpretation of the same material, not through words, but in a series of architectural projects. These proposals are the provisional product of Manhattanism as a conscious doctrine, whose pertinence is no longer limited to the island of its invention. So that's what's going to happen at the end of the book. And what we have is a series of 4 strange projects by Rem Koolhaas and collaborators.
And they exist in a kind of strange way as well. They exist as a manifesto story, essay, and axo rendered in very flat colour. Yeah.
So there's the earliest of them is this one, The City of the Captive Globe. Almost like an illustration of the thesis, of like part of the thesis of like his idea of Manhattanism, and it's a kind of slightly surreal
and
paper
these projects,
architect.
by the way, are not just by. I think it's quite important to say they're not just by Rem Koolhaas. They were with significant collaboration.
So this one is by Rem and Zoe Zenghelis.
Yep.
Hotel Sphinx is actually by Elia and Zoe Zenghelis without Rem Koolhaas. New Welfare Island and the Welfare Palace Hotel are with kind of larger teams, paintings by Zoe Zenghelis and Madelon Vriesendorp, respectively. And then, they did have students and interns helping them. Yeah, this one is kind of comes, I guess, quite early on in the process that's eventually going to lead up to the book. And in a way, it's a kind of illustration of the idea before it's been completely formulated. It's this sort of, I mean, you can read a little bit of the text, which is sort of an idea of they're all a bit like this. The City of the Captive Globe is devoted to the artificial conception and accelerated birth of theories, interpretations, mental constructions, proposals, and their infliction on the world. Each science or mania has its own plot. On each plot stands an identical base, built from heavy polished stone. From these solid blocks of granite, each philosophy has the right to expand indefinitely toward heaven, etc., etc., etc. And then what you have on these, it's like there's a ground plane. There are these very dark, kind of plinth-like blocks. And then on top of each of them, sort of arranged a little bit like exhibits in a sculpture gallery of some kind, are recognisable pastiches or articulations of kind of recognisable architectural ideas. So you've got 2 of Le Corbusier's little Cartesian skyscrapers. What else you've got?
You've got something that's a bit like the centre of the Rockefeller Centre.
Oh, yeah.
You've got
a Malevich architecton.
You've got some blob texture.
Yeah.
You've got something that looks a bit like future
Super Studio,
sorry.
Yeah.
You've got some trees.
Yeah.
Well, that's enough. I mean, there's more things.
Yeah.
And then in the middle there is his kind of icon of this project, which is globes.
Yeah.
So there's a leitmotif.
Yeah.
Of globes and spheres. It starts actually with the dome of the first World's Fair.
Yeah.
And it ends with the globe at the World's Fair of 1939.
Yeah.
And that's like going through a whole series of them. But it's also obviously the world being stuck in a box. And you can see here that the ideas really are like this whole work of theory is, as it says in the title, retconning.
Yeah.
It's a retrospective. He's making up theories to justify a manifesto for a thing that's already happened.
Yeah.
And he's also kind of making up what it is that's happened.
Yeah.
And he's fine with that.
Yeah.
And I think if you're reading this, you're fine with that too. Or at least you've got to be aware that's what's going on. His presentations are really abstract. They're axiometrics and coloured and abstracted.
Palettes are kind of pastel. I mean, the nature of axonometric is that you're generally...
It's the most unreal projection.
It's non-spatial, yeah. It's kind of, it's a projection of sort of assembly. I mean, you can obviously show...
How to assemble a IKEA wardrobe van.
Yeah. It can't really show you experiences, or it can only talk about them in a very abstract way.
Yeah.
Through kind of some sort of symbology,
But it can inform you about shapes.
Yeah.
It just can't tell you how big they are.
It renders everything as a kind of chessboard, as these everything become these little kind of chess pieces.
which is a much more avant-garde way than the renderings of these pragmatic architects who tend to render like in color and light, and which is interesting. But that's all this is. It's very simple. It's like 1.5 pages of text. Why do you think they're all on polished black slabs?
Don't know. Just feels good, doesn't it?
You've got a grid of a city where you've just projected the inside of the grid up a lot to separate it from the street or the ground level.
Yeah.
But anyway, that's kind of what he wants it to be like.
Yeah.
He wants skyscrapers to be architectural playgrounds.
Yeah.
But here, actually, the exterior expression is radically different rather than the interior energetic core.
Yeah, no, that's all going to come later, isn't it? At the moment, they're pure icons, and what they symbolize are this kind of these different
diversity of approaches.
Yeah.
Experimental play in a box. Everything is in a box.
Yeah. And there's the thing of, I mean, what they talk about in the text is this idea that the fact that they're all different is also reinforcing the kind of the system of the grid of lots of different things. That the two are in a kind of...
Yes, even.
Yeah.
The whole thing is even, and then each thing has got a freedom of a constraint, which is that it has to exist on top of big oblong. And that is the extent of the proposal. Right, we can do the next one.
Yeah. Okay. Hotel Sphinx.
This one's quite famous. I learned about it first because of the cover, because it was on the cover of that book over there.
Oh yeah. So this is kind of so it's for Times Square, and it's straddling over 2 blocks. It's kind of wacky and cool. It's got
very period, isn't it?
It's got like a big cylindrical tower, and then it's got 2 funny little towers at the other end, and it's got these 2. The massing is sort of staircase cascading massing, but kind of split in half with one going either way, so that it's like a sort of scissors or something like that meeting in the middle. I mean, the story about this one is much more a kind of description of all of the different things which are going on inside its program. Like the facade is largely a sort of wallpaper of lots and lots of individual little square windows. There's an articulation where you get to the kind of top of the massing, and where you get maybe a bit on the front of the big tower, but there is a bit of that sense of the facade that doesn't tell you anything, and then all sorts of different things going on behind it. So what has it got in it? It's got
a hotel in the main bit, and then it's got like a leisure bit in the tower, which is a complicated, like, fun bathhouse.
And it's also got some apartments in it. And it's got all of these pools, all of the terraces which are going down are swimming pools, right?
I thought the pool was in the tower.
Oh, no, those are private gardens. They're like little villa houses with private gardens.
The steps.
Yeah,
that's right. The pool's in the tower.
Yeah.
So, but crucially, this is a Rome Koolhaas skyscraper because it is formally complex. It is made of multiple towers. Yeah. The exterior belies the interior. The interior occupation is very diverse. It is a mixture of villas, a bit like his early on example of the idea of, like, you've got like these gantries and you can just build villas on them right at the beginning of the skyscraper zone. It's got these different complicated masses where you can't really tell what's in them. Yeah. And then there's this tower, which is a kind of fun zone. The head of the Sphinx is dedicated to physical culture and relaxation. The main feature is a swimming pool. Glazed screen divides the pool into 2 parts, indoors and outdoors. Swimmers can dive under the screen to either part.
It's almost, this one, the description is almost only like a description of program. The Sphinx is the only thing, it says the Sphinx is a luxury hotel as a model for mass housing.
Well, it's an image and a short text, right? That's what this thing is.
Yeah, but it's a different sort of text. Like the City of the Captive Globe text sort of tells you what the idea is.
Yeah, but I think what the idea here is super clear, which is that this is like a series of things combined together that are in the book. It's the sauna gym tower with a sort of like hotel club strapped to the back of it with a complicated fancy shape. Yeah. And jokes.
I mean, there are parts of it which are like very deconstructivist, you've got this sort of weird hole in the middle of the massing with something kind of poking through, and you've got this kind of gallery in the bottom which seems to be almost sort of dissolving or something like that. And you've got these kind of curious kinetic elements which are very seem to be drawing on like avant-garde architecture.
Yeah, and then
the 2 funny mini towers are quite novel though, aren't
chimneys.
They? Yeah, these sort of.
you'd see things like that in kind of funny avant-garde modernist things. The problem with them, they're novel as a shape because they're not very useful.
Yeah, anticipation of the super tall. Yeah, okay.
So I mean, what's going on with this is like it's quite a cool project. Or the image, at least, is a cool image. But it's like, okay, we're gonna do one of these. We're gonna take the brief you set us, and we're gonna follow the rules, which you haven't articulated precisely, but we're gonna follow them and produce this thing, and it's cool.
Yeah.
Again, this feels like an extremely well done student project.
Yeah.
Like, you've produced an insane brief.
Yeah.
By analysing something, and then you've executed the same brief and got something that looks really cool. That's like great.
Then there's New Welfare Island. So this is more of like an urban proposal for Roosevelt Island. This island in between Manhattan and is it Queens? Yeah.
Well, yeah.
They had developed a little bit of it in the post-war in what he obviously finds to be a rather unsatisfactory way. It's kind of channeling the spirit of the City of the Captive Globe again, isn't it? They kind of, you put together you lay out these sort of blocks, and then there are various things going on the blocks which are like more or less strange or demonstrative. There's an idea that you would like put a bunch of buildings that were famous proposals that never got built in New York, and like this is where they can finally be constructed.
The rendering of this, which is there's this mat of the blocks, which are just rendered as flat grey on cream.
Yeah.
And then the various elements of the proposal and of other proposals are drawn in axo and coloured.
Yeah.
And the water is blue, which feels constructivist.
Yeah.
And very, very period. And very uncongested, very diagrammatic. They're cool graphically.
There's
two revolving doors at either end lead to locker rooms. Locker rooms are also very important.
Yeah.
Pleasure zones. Inside the two halves of the bridge, one for men and the other for women. Undressed, the sexes emerge from the middle of the bridge where they can swim to the recessed beach.
Yeah.
It also, the proposal, I think, like sort of initiates the kind of seed crystal for a new bit of Manhattan, and then allows the rest of it to be developed. I think the idea is that like at insufficient density, the city is sort of bad. And that also we must resist the Beaux-Arts instinct to plan.
Yeah, to plan everything.
The thing with the grid is that you set the grid and the air rights restriction, or the grid and the like massing restriction, give you like sharp constriction into which you can do almost anything. Is the kind of core of the idea, and he's wanting to like generate some more of that so that something else unexpected can occur. And more cool stuff, travelators and what you. And then there's the hotel,
which is then developed as its own
project,
the Welfare Palace Hotel.
So another thing that the Welfare Island is it's like Coney Island.
Yeah.
It has travelators and attractions and strange things. The Welfare Palace Hotel has got a sort of big hotel massing. Again, it's very like the brief for his skyscrapers. And it also has a perpetual recreation of a sinking ship.
Yeah.
With different elements. The raft of the Medusa, the painting.
Yeah.
Is sort of recreated. Kind of you can be serene or chaotic like that. The raft of the Medusa is a 19th century French painting of a depicting in kind of high classical style. There was a shipwreck, and then the survivors got onto a raft, and it got worse and worse, and then they ended up in cannibalism and all. It was this kind of story of the total collapse of society, and then that's kind of set against. That's kind of used as a metaphor for Manhattan, I guess. This like extreme collapse. He's again enjoying the theatricality, like the reason that the head moves in this hotel Sphinx, and the reason for the travelators is that these buildings are works of theatre.
And they're also channeling the relentless energy of the city.
Yeah.
Yeah, the idea of like disaster. I think he loves the fact that there's the Coney Island attraction where you can watch people fighting a fire, as a sort of performance, and the idea that people are enraptured by the idea of disaster, like disaster is always on the horizon for the big city. So the Raft of the Medusa is the sort of spectacle that everyone is watching from is it sort of riverside nightclub?
It's a theatre and nightclub restaurant, the twin theme of shipwreck on a halogenated island. The floor is inundated. A stage is carved out of the steel harnel of an overturned sinking ship. Columns are disguised as lighthouses, because this is obviously inside the building.
Yeah.
Frantically piercing the terraces. Guests can sit, eat, and watch performances on the terrace along the water, or they can board the lifeboats, luxuriously equipped with velvet benches and marble tabletops that emerge from a hole in the sinking ship to move slowly through the interior on submerged tracks. Opposite the sinking ship is a sandy island, symbolising Manhattan's Virgin State, which can be used for dancing. And then you can also go over on the other side, so there's the original state, and then there's the Raft of the Medusa side.
Yeah.
And then the image itself looks like, again, the thing is like, you can't tell how exploded the Axo is. It's floating in black space with flat coloured planes. The raft and things like are separated, atomized, and the whole thing appears like it's hovering in space. The image is like super cool, like the other ones, but it isn't an image which has a clear metaphorical. It's not clear to be metaphorically interpreted. It doesn't seem human or party-like or particularly theatrical. It seems graphic. It has like intense graphic qualities because of this kind of like detail, points of detail and points of space, and like very sharp contrast. But it's not at all a humanistic response. None of the proposals are. They're all very dry.
That's part of the fun of them, isn't them? There's a kind of ironic distance, and everything is depicted as... Like, there are these little moments of sort of inhabitation. There are actual figures, or there are things which are sort of recognisably little rooms and things. But
yeah, the things that are described in the text are represented, but they're represented...
Yeah.
In a method that is more abstract than the safety information card on an aeroplane.
Yeah.
But with sort of the same flat temperament, you know.
Yeah.
And then there's the last one, which is actually not a proposal, but a short story.
Yeah. Lots of them appear in the drawings for each other. They're like a little set. Yeah, this is the story of the pool, basically connecting Moscow in the avant-garde early 1920s with the New York of the present day, which is obviously a kind of connection that's been latent all the way through the story. I guess this is another sort of little Rosetta Stone moment for trying to understand what the book is really about. The story of the pool is basically a bunch of avant-garde architects design and make a floating swimming pool, which he places, in a sort of context alongside all sorts of other things that people were designing at the time. Like, people were literally designing sort of flying cities, or they were designing, people were designing all kinds of amazing, kind of totally crazy stuff. And his little fantasy is that they actually build this thing when it kind of heats up in the sort of slightly more Stalinist late 20s, early 30s. The students all get in the pool, and it turns out if they all swim in the same direction, that they can kind of drive it like a boat. And so in the story, they drive it all the way over across the Atlantic, which takes them about 50 years, and they eventually arrive in
the then present day.
Yeah, in the then present day Manhattan. Are greeted with sort of incomprehension. People come, like the businessmen come in and sort of try and start using the pool immediately. There is no kind of grand moment of arrival. Nothing exactly makes sense. They become disenchanted and then they drive off again.
Yeah.
And then on the way past, they run through the raft of the Medusa and sink it.
Yeah.
That's the edge of the story.
And it's a satire both of Le Corbusier's arrival.
Yeah.
Of the state of like theory where everyone kind of likes some of this modernist avant-garde stuff, but they're all embarrassed about it.
Yeah.
And it's like they like the idea of Europe, but like now it's just really passé. And then it's also a bit like a story of aliens misunderstanding of communicating with aliens, I thought. Or like something that was like riffing off those sort of stories of the time.
Yeah.
Or like, two different cultural people meet and there is no comprehension. I also hope that it's partly wanting a happy ending for these extremely persecuted avant-garde Russians.
Yeah, I guess.
Like, there's a wish fulfillment, like, oh.
But it's also, I guess it's also, there's a pathos in the kind of inability of them to communicate with each other. They're separated by time and by place, and then there's this kind of...
And completely by temperament.
And then there's a kind of miraculous story which sort of brings them together, but they can't understand each other. It's a sort of experiment in a kind, and then rejection of a kind of wish fulfillment, I guess.
Yeah.
And I think it's sort of also satirizing interest in importing some of the valor of these, the appearance of these sorts of exciting architectural visions.
Yeah, which is what he's doing.
World. Yeah.
Like,
I guess there's an element of self-satire in it. It's an interesting... I mean, I enjoy it as a place for the book to end. It's a kind of mic drop, isn't it? That's the...
Yeah,
the ending is that these two things that he's invented crash into each other and sink in the East River. And that's the end.
There is no easy way from the earth to the stars. In front of the Welfare Palace Hotel, the raft of the constructivists collides with the raft of the Medusa. Optimism versus pessimism. The steel of the pool slices through the plastic of the sculpture like a knife through butter. And that is the end of Delirious New York.
That's the end of Delirious New York, yeah.
And I think really, like, if you want to know what the contents of the book is, it's not bad to start with the title. Delirious New York.
Yeah.
A retroactive manifesto for Manhattan.
Good title.
Well, it's a title that describes what he's doing.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's not real. It's not like clear, conscious New York.
It's a
the
dream.
Development of an urban form in the first half of the 20th century. I can see why this was really exciting.
Well,
it's funnier than the architecture of the city, for example.
Yeah.
It's certainly funnier than like Jane Jacobs or whatever. It's much less political. You don't have to... You can kind of follow this with any political thing as long as you don't take politics very seriously. The agency of architecture in this theory is just that you can make a cool, fun place.
Yeah, that's it.
You're not trying to make anyone's lives better.
Except through making them more
Except through
entertaining.
making it more lively. But it's not...
No, you're not
about like trying to
intensify
the city.
You're not going to heal the world, or...
Yeah.
He obviously got quite sick of talking about it quite quickly, because even in the...
Oh, I mean, like, he got sick of talking about it, I think, by the time the book came out.
Yeah. And
he was enjoying talking about it while he was writing it.
Yeah.
But that's often the way. I mean, my God, once you've finished writing something, you're really sick of it, aren't you?
Yeah, I expect so. Yeah, definitely worth a read, though.
Yeah. I think we're both a bit played out at this point.
Yeah.
So, thank you very much.
Thanks a lot for listening.
There are supporting materials available on social media.
Yeah.
There is extra content available on Patreon for money. Money which provides the ability of this to exist.
Yeah.
Pays for Matt and literally putting the podcast up and that sort of thing. We're very, very thankful for those people that support us.
Yes, thank you very much.
I enjoyed doing this series.
But yeah, fun to talk about it. It's been a bit...
Thank you very, very much for listening.
Thank you for listening.
We wouldn't do it if no one was listening.
No.
And because...
We wouldn't have kept doing it for so long. I think we would have stopped.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And because of that, we've been able to do all these things, which has taught me a lot.
Well, see you next time. Bye-bye.